They lived in a quiet suburb where everything seemed perfect. A house with a manicured lawn, 5 smiling children, a family where love and faith reigned. Neighbors saw them almost every day. Walks with the children, Sunday prayers, friendly conversations over the fence. But behind this facade of well-being lurked something terrible. Where others saw peace, despair slowly grew within. Anxiety, exhaustion, and a darkness no one noticed. This story isn't just about a crime. It's a story about how illness, faith, and loneliness can collide and destroy everything once considered sacred. Andrea Pia Kennedy was born on July 2, 1964, in Hallsville, Texas. She was the youngest of 5 children in a strict Catholic family. Her childhood was marked by discipline and prayer. Her mother was a housewife, her father a mechanic. Everything in their home revolved around work and faith. From a young age, Andrea was distinguished by her introverted nature, diligence, and a strong desire to be perfect. She avoided conflict, always obeyed her parents, and was afraid of disappointing others. Her classmates remembered her as a quiet, slightly shy but kind girl. After high school, Andrea attended the University of Houston and earned a nursing degree. Working at the hospital gave her a sense of purpose, helping others, caring. Co-workers said she rarely smiled, but was always attentive and polite. In 1989, Andrea met Russell Yates, a NASA engineer 10 years her senior. He was confident, rational, and religious. They first met by the pool at the apartment complex where they both rented apartments. They immediately connected. Rusty, as his friends called him, was charmed by Andrea's modesty. She, for her part, saw reliability and spiritual strength in him. Their relationship developed quickly. A few months after meeting, they moved in together, and in 1993, they married. The wedding was modest. They dreamed of a large family and a life based on Christian principles. During the first years of their marriage, Andrea worked as a nurse, and Rusty pursued a career. But he soon convinced his wife that a woman should be at home with her children and in prayer. In 1994, their first child, Noah, was born. For Andrea, it was the beginning of a new life. She adored the baby and devoted all her time to him, but she was gradually becoming exhausted. 2 years later, a second son, John, was born, then a third, Paul. With each new child, the workload increased, and Rusty became increasingly religious. He was inspired by the sermons of a man named Michael Warnicki, a former street preacher who argued that the modern world was corrupt and sinful, and that a woman should be completely submissive to her husband and bear as many children as God allows. Influenced by this teaching, Rusty decided their family should give up everything worldly: television, entertainment, and socializing with neighbors. He bought an old bus and converted it into a mobile home. Andrea didn't argue, although living in cramped quarters with 3 small children without a phone or television was gradually destroying her psyche. She became increasingly anxious. Neighbors later recalled how she could sit silently for hours, staring into space, then suddenly smile and talk about God. By the late 1990s, Andrea and Rusty Yates already had 3 small children. Their life was completely governed by religious principles. No parties, no friends, no entertainment. Everything revolved around family, parenting, and prayer. But beneath this outward idyll, something began to break down in Andrea. After the birth of their 4th child, little Luke, in June 1999, Andrea began to change before her very eyes. She barely slept, sitting for hours with the baby in her arms, staring into space. Sometimes she would whisper prayers under her breath, repeating the same words over and over. Rusty initially dismissed it, thinking his wife was simply tired. But Andrea quickly sank into a rut from which she could never escape. She stopped eating, lost weight, avoided conversations, and stopped looking people in the eye. One day when Rusty came home, he found a terrifying scene. Andrea was sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth, pulling out her hair and muttering, "I'm a bad mother. My children are doomed. I have to save them from evil." It was her first real breakdown. Rusty called an ambulance. Doctors diagnosed her with postpartum depression with psychotic elements, one of the most severe mental health conditions that can affect a woman after childbirth. She was hospitalized. There, she was in critical condition. She didn't speak, didn't smile, and refused to eat. Doctors prescribed antipsychotic medications, Haldol and Risperdal. The medications helped, but only while they were being taken. When Andrea improved, Rusty insisted on her discharge. He believed that prayer and family could replace medication. He brought her home, confident that love would fix everything. But the doctors warned, "Don't leave her alone with the children. Not for a minute." Rusty, however, didn't listen. He didn't understand the depth of the abyss into which his wife was falling. After her discharge, Andrea tried to be perfect again. She smiled at the neighbors, walked with the children, cooked, and prayed. But in a diary found later, she wrote, "I don't feel God. I feel nothing, only fear." Doctors said another pregnancy could be fatal not only physically, but also mentally. But Rusty didn't trust the doctors. He was certain God decided how many children they would have. And in November 2000, Andrea gave birth to her 5th child, a girl, Mary. The photographs from her discharge show a smiling father, children with balloons, and a tired mother with a blank look. It's as if she's looking through the camera. The first months after giving birth were difficult. Andrea barely slept. She constantly heard voices insisting that her children would die in hell. Sometimes she would look at them and quietly cry, saying, "They're so pure. I can't let them become contaminated by this world." With each passing day, her condition worsened. She began to lose touch with reality. At some point, Andrea stopped speaking and simply sat in the corner of the room, staring into space. In March 2001, she made her first suicide attempt. She took a whole handful of pills. She was saved, but she confessed to her doctor that the voices told her to die. After being discharged, she was kept under observation, but returned home too early. Just a few weeks later, another episode occurred. Rusty woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't find his wife. He searched the house and found her standing in the bathroom, cutting her hair with a razor blade and whispering, "I have to get rid of this evil." After that, she was sent back to the hospital. The diagnosis was the same: postpartum psychosis. She was treated with the same medication, Haldol, which helped. But when Andrea began complaining of side effects, Rusty insisted that the treatment be stopped. The doctor who was treating her later said, "I begged her husband not to stop the therapy. I told him that if she stopped taking the medication, it would end in disaster." 2 weeks after stopping the medication, Andrea sank into darkness again. She stopped smiling, saying that Satan was living in her house. Sometimes she would sit on the floor, holding a Bible, and whisper that her children were possessed and that God demands a sacrifice. Neighbors recalled that in the weeks before the tragedy, she seemed lost. She walked with the children, not speaking, her face devoid of emotion. The day before the fateful morning, Rusty left on a business trip, leaving Andrea in the care of his mother. She promised to watch the children, but was scheduled to leave the next morning for just an hour, and it was during this time that everything happened. The summer in Houston was hot and muggy. The morning of June 21st was no different from dozens of others. Clear skies, the smell of freshly cut grass, the cries of neighbors' children, the sound of a lawnmower beyond the fence. The Yates house was immersed in silence. Inside, behind closed curtains, 5 little children were waking up, unaware that this day would be their last. Rusty left for work a little before 9 in the morning. He kissed his wife, checked to make sure the coffee was warm, and, as usual, said his mother would be over later to help with the children. Andrea looked calm, but there was something distant in her gaze. She had barely spoken in the last few days, moving slowly, as if by inertia. She had spent the night awake, wandering around the house, straightening toys and linens. When the door closed behind her husband, the house became especially quiet. Rusty's mother did come in briefly. She brought food, played with the children, and made sure everything seemed okay. Andrea's eyes were dull, but she smiled and assured her she could handle it. Half an hour later, her mother-in-law left, leaving her alone. Now it was just her and the children. The eldest, Noah, was 7. He was reading a book in the living room. The youngest, Mary, just 6 months old, was asleep in her crib. The others ran around the house, arguing, laughing, the usual morning chaos familiar to every mother of many children. But Andrea was restless inside. For several days, she'd felt a nagging sense of dread, as if an invisible force were watching her, as if everything around her was sinful and doomed. Her thoughts flowed quickly and tangled, like a stream in which it was impossible to discern beginning and end. She tried to pray, but the words lost their meaning. About an hour after her mother-in-law left, she entered the kitchen, turned on the water, and stood for a long time, staring into the sink. Her head was ringing. At that moment, reality seemed to split. Part of her understood what was happening, while the other part sank into a delusional conviction that she must act, that procrastination was evil. Time seemed to stand still. The minutes dragged on endlessly. A dog barked outside. A mail truck passed somewhere. Inside the house, deathly silence. The subsequent events were reconstructed from Andrea's own testimony and the investigation. Everything happened quickly, in 20 minutes at most. The house gradually turned into a place of unimaginable horror. Later, investigators will reconstruct the events based on Andrea's testimony and forensic evidence. It all began approximately half an hour after her mother-in-law left the house. The woman acted calmly, without panic, in a state of severe psychotic delirium, believing she was saving the children from eternal damnation. She started with the youngest. Mary, a 6-month-old baby, was asleep in a crib. Andrea carried her to the bathroom. Then she called the boys, one by one. 2-year-old Luke came first. He was too young to understand what was happening. 3-year-old Paul followed, then 5-year-old John. According to investigators, each child was in the water for no more than a minute. Afterwards, Andrea carried their bodies into the bedroom and carefully laid them on the bed, next to each other, covered with a towel. Everything happened in an oppressive, almost mechanical silence. The eldest son, Noah, was in the living room at the time. He realized something was wrong with the younger ones when he heard the sound of running water and crying. He tried to run away, but his mother caught up with him. He was the only child who realized what was happening and tried to resist. When it was all over, Andrea placed Mary, the youngest, in Noah's arms, as if trying to connect them all. Then she sat on the floor and stared into space for a moment. When it was all over, Andrea went into the bathroom, turned on the water, and stood there without a word. The water flowed, filling the space with a cold humming sound. Then she turned off the faucet, dried her hands, went out into the hallway, and, as if in a daze, dialed 911.
Of town.
What's your name? What's the problem? I just need him to come. Is your husband there? No. Well, what's the problem? I need him to come. I need to know why we're coming, ma'am. Is he there standing next to you? She? Are you having disturbance? Are you ill or what? Yes, I'm ill. You need an ambulance? No, I need a police officer. Send an ambulance.
The officers arrived a few minutes later. A pale, soaking wet woman in a long gray t-shirt stood in the doorway. She looked as if the life had already drained from her. She didn't resist, didn't make any excuses. She simply stood there. The officers entered and saw what would later be called one of the most terrifying scenes they had ever encountered. People were gathering outside. Neighbors couldn't understand why the street was cordoned off, why so many cars with flashing lights were there. When the news reached the press, headlines filled every news outlet. America stood in shock. Rusty was at work when he received the call. He didn't immediately understand what had happened. When he returned home, he saw a crowd of journalists and police tapes surrounding his house. He would later say it felt as if the ground had vanished beneath him. That morning, not only their house but their entire life had collapsed. News of what happened in the Houston suburbs spread across the country in a matter of hours. Reporters flocked to the Yates home, and cameras captured every corner of the facade, every crack in the wall. America couldn't believe this had happened in a respectable home, with a seemingly well-off mother, a woman neighbors called quiet and exemplary. Society was divided. Some demanded a harsh punishment, the death penalty, believing that no illness justified her actions. Others saw her not as a murderer, but as a victim of her own psyche and male control, pushed to the limit. The police immediately noted that Andrea made no attempt to escape and showed no aggression. She seemed completely detached, as if she didn't understand what she had done. Investigators said her behavior was more reminiscent of deep psychosis than cold calculation. During interrogation, she spoke of her faith, her fear of sin, and her sense of hopelessness. According to doctors, she was convinced that she was doing something saving for the children, not harmful. The trial began in February 2002 and lasted several months. The courtroom was almost deathly silent. Andrea looked pale and haggard. She didn't look up, and she didn't respond to the cameras or journalists. The prosecution claimed that, despite her mental illness, she understood what she was doing. Their argument was based on Andrea's consistent actions, her call to the police, and her knowledge of what would happen next. This, they argued, proved awareness of her actions. But defense psychiatrists argued otherwise. It was a classic case of postpartum psychosis, a rare but extremely dangerous condition in which a person loses touch with reality. At such moments, the boundaries of good and evil blur, leaving only a distorted sense of mission. Nevertheless, the jury found her guilty. Andrea Yates was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. When the judge read the verdict, she didn't cry. She simply nodded quietly, as if in agreement. Rusty attended every hearing. He looked distraught, aging a decade. After the trial, he told reporters that he didn't consider his wife a monster. He blamed the system for discharging her from the hospital without noticing the danger. 4 years passed before the justice system reopened the case. In 2006, the Texas Supreme Court overturned the verdict, finding that false information from an expert had been used in the original trial. A new forensic psychiatric evaluation confirmed that Andrea was insane at the time of the tragedy. She was transferred from prison to a maximum security psychiatric hospital, the place where she remains today. There are no bars on the windows, but the doors are always locked. Patients live in sterile silence, where every day is the same. Andrea leads a reclusive life, avoids socializing, draws, reads the Bible, and, according to doctors, still considers herself unworthy of forgiveness. The Yates case became one of the most high-profile legal dramas of the early 2000s. It sparked a storm of discussion, from talk shows to academic conferences. Journalists and doctors began openly discussing what had previously been hushed up. Postpartum psychosis is common, and it can be deadly. Before this case, many believed that postpartum depression was simply fatigue and emotional instability, not a disease. Following the Yates case, special programs to help women after childbirth, support centers, and hotlines began to appear in the United States. Rusty Yates gave several interviews years later. He acknowledged he'd missed out on a lot. He believed his wife simply needed faith and family, but now understood that prayer couldn't cure her illness. He said he forgave Andrea, held no grudges, and that, as scary as it sounded, he believed she truly loved her children. He continued living in Texas, moved house, changed jobs, and remarried. He had more children, but according to friends, he never stopped talking about the 5 children. Every June, he visits the cemetery where Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary are buried, and spends the entire day there. At the clinic, Andrea doesn't watch television, doesn't read newspapers, and barely speaks to other patients. Doctors say she still understands what she did and suffers from it. Sometimes she draws children's faces, the sun, a house similar to the one where they once lived. These drawings are the only thing that remains of the woman who once dreamed of a large family and faith in salvation. This story isn't just a crime story. It's a mirror of how thin the line is between reality and madness, between faith and fanaticism, between love and destruction. Andrea Yates wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. She was a sick woman, abandoned without help, living under the pressure of ideals that left her no room for weakness. The combination of isolation, endless fatigue, religious fear, and unsupported illness became an explosive mixture. No one reached out when it could still have been stopped. After this incident, many mothers experiencing similar feelings began seeking help, and perhaps that's the only thing that makes this whole story worthwhile.
Think things that aren't real.
So because of that mental illness, you're not angry with her, you don't blame her for what happened?
I don't blame her a bit, and that's people find that just outrageous, I know, but I don't blame her one bit.